The 4th of June, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm over the Central Pacific, yet beneath that tranquil surface churned forces that would reshape the entire Second World War. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the battleship Yamato, over 300 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, his mind wrestling with calculations of distance, fuel, and fortune, unaware that his meticulously orchestrated plan was already unraveling like silk thread caught on a nail. 6 months earlier, Japan had seemed invincible. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, the Philippines had fallen, and the rising sun flag flew over territories stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor's devastation, understood what Tokyo's euphoric generals did not. America's industrial might, once fully awakened, would crush Japan through sheer material superiority. His only hope lay in forcing a decisive battle that would cripple the United States Pacific Fleet beyond recovery, compelling Washington to negotiate a settlement that would preserve Japan's conquests. Midway Atoll, that tiny spit of sand and coral 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, became the anvil upon which he would hammer American naval power into submission. The plan possessed an elegant complexity that reflected Yamamoto's chess master's mind. He would dispatch a diversionary force to the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward, while his main striking force, 4 fleet carriers escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, would pummel Midway's defenses into rubble. When the American carriers inevitably rushed to defend their outpost, Japanese naval aviation would annihilate them. According to research documented in Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway, by historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, Yamamoto's confidence stemmed from Japan's carrier aviation supremacy, which had proven devastatingly effective from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon. Yet confidence had metastasized into dangerous assumption. Japanese intelligence, once formidable, had grown complacent. They believed the carrier Yorktown remained crippled in Pearl Harbor's shipyards, knocked out of action during the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier. They assumed American codebreakers remained blind to Japanese communications. They presumed their timetable allowed sufficient margin for error. Every assumption was catastrophically wrong. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had penetrated Japan's naval code with sufficient clarity to discern Yamamoto's intentions. They identified AF, the mysterious target in Japanese dispatches, as Midway through an ingenious ruse. Having Midway broadcast an uncoded message about freshwater shortage, then intercepting Japanese communications reporting AF had water problems. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, possessed what Yamamoto lacked: foreknowledge of his enemy's plans. Meanwhile, Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers accomplished the impossible. The Yorktown, her hull gashed and flight deck scarred from Coral Sea, required an estimated 90 days for proper repairs. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. Welders worked around the clock, their torches blazing through Hawaiian nights, while electricians rewired damaged systems and carpenters shored up weakened bulkheads. The carrier limped from dry dock barely seaworthy, trailing oil and listing slightly, but she could launch aircraft, and that sufficed. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16 with carriers Enterprise and Hornet, while Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher led Task Force 17 centered on the patched Yorktown. They positioned themselves northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese reconnaissance range, waiting with predatory patience for the unsuspecting enemy to sail into American crosshairs. Yamamoto's armada approached Midway in separate groups, scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier striking force: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same vessels that had devastated Pearl Harbor. These floating airfields carried Japan's elite pilots, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, men who had perfected their deadly craft through years of warfare. Their Zero fighters ruled the skies. Their dive bombers and torpedo planes had sent dozens of ships to the ocean floor. But the Japanese fleet carried a fatal vulnerability embedded in its very design. Their carriers stored ordnance and aviation fuel with minimal protection, prioritizing offensive striking power over defensive resilience, a calculated trade-off that assumed Japanese superiority would prevent enemy aircraft from reaching their decks. As darkness fell on the 3rd of June, Both fleets steamed toward collision, each side convinced of advantages the other didn't know they lacked. The morning of the 4th of June arrived with scattered clouds drifting lazily across the Pacific sky as Vice Admiral Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Atoll at 4:30 in the morning. 108 aircraft, horizontal bombers, dive bombers, and Zero fighters roared off Japanese flight decks, their engines' thunder swallowed by vast ocean emptiness. Nagumo retained half his strike aircraft aboard the 4 carriers, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically intended for attacking American warships. This reserve force represented standard Japanese doctrine: maintain a powerful counterpunch capability against unexpected threats. Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi led the strike formation southward through the darkness toward Midway, unaware that American radar operators had already detected his approach while the planes were still 93 miles distant. The tiny atoll erupted into organized chaos as sirens wailed across its installations. Marine fighters, antiquated Brewster Buffaloes, and slightly more capable Grumman Wildcats scrambled desperately skyward to intercept the attackers, while anti-aircraft crews took their positions around the island's precious infrastructure. The aerial combat proved brutally one-sided. Japanese Zeros, nimble and deadly, carved through the outmatched marine fighters with contemptuous ease. The Buffaloes, derided as flying coffins by their pilots, fell from the sky like wounded birds. Yet the Marines fought with ferocious determination, their sacrifice buying precious minutes for Midway's bombers to launch and escape. Captain Richard Fleming and Captain Elmer Glidden led their Douglas Dauntless dive bombers and lumbering torpedo planes toward the Japanese fleet, while Tomonaga's strike force hammered Midway's installations. The Japanese attack inflicted substantial damage. Fuel tanks erupted in flames, buildings collapsed under bomb impacts, runways cratered, but failed to neutralize Midway as an operational base. More critically, Tomonaga radioed back a message that would trigger the cascade of Japanese misfortune. There is need for a second attack. According to Walter Lord's detailed account in Incredible Victory, this transmission represented the first fateful decision in a chain that would doom the Kido Butai. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo faced an agonizing dilemma. His reserve strike force remained armed for attacking ships, but Tomonaga insisted Midway required additional bombardment. Japanese doctrine emphasized thorough neutralization of land targets before proceeding with fleet operations. After conferring with his staff, Nagumo issued the order at 7:15, rearm the reserve aircraft with land attack bombs. Deep in the carrier's hangars, ordnance crews began the laborious process of striking torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from aircraft bellies, wheeling them aside, then hoisting high-explosive bombs into place. Aviation fuel lines snaked across hangar decks. Ammunition handlers stacked the removed ship-killing weapons haphazardly against bulkheads. There was no time for proper stowage. The carriers transformed into floating ammunition depots where a single spark might trigger catastrophe. Then, at 7:28, a Japanese scout plane transmitted 6 words that revolutionized Nagumo's tactical situation. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. The transmission originated from a tone cruiser's floatplane, launched a half-hour late due to catapult mechanical problems. Timing's first betrayal of Japanese precision. Nagumo's staff officers froze. American surface ships? Where? The scout's initial message maddeningly omitted composition and bearing, forcing agonizing minutes of uncertainty. At 7:45, Nagumo ordered another reversal. Suspend rearming operations pending clarification of American force composition. If American carriers lurked nearby, his reserve strike force needed ship-killing weapons, not land bombs. 15 minutes later, at 8 o'clock, the scout reported additional details but still no confirmation of carriers. Nagumo's bridge officers debated furiously. Launch immediately with whatever aircraft were ready? Wait for Tomonaga's strike force to return and refuel before committing to a major attack? Every passing minute heightened tension. Meanwhile, Midway's bombers found the Japanese fleet. Marine Captain Henderson led his dauntless dive bombers into steep dives through murderous anti-aircraft fire and Zero interceptors. The Marines pressed their attacks with suicidal courage, boring straight through defensive fire, yet their bombs struck only water. 6 planes fell burning into the Pacific, Army B-17 heavy bombers arrived next, dropping their payloads from high altitude, an ineffective tactic against maneuvering ships. Then came the torpedo bombers, slow, vulnerable Douglas devastators carrying tin fish that ran too slowly and exploded too rarely. The American attacks achieved nothing tactically but accomplished everything strategically. They forced Nagumo's carriers into evasive maneuvers, disrupting rearming operations and preventing organized launch preparations. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol decimated the attackers. American torpedo bombers died in flames and wreckage, but the constant harassment bought priceless time. At 8:20, the scout plane finally confirmed Nagumo's nightmare. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. 5 words that shattered the operational plan. Nagumo faced impossible choices, all bad. His reserve strike force sat in various states of readiness, some aircraft armed with torpedoes, others with bombs, some fueled, others not. Tominaga's Midway strike force would return shortly, fuel tanks nearly empty, needing immediate recovery, or they would ditch in the ocean. The flight decks must be cleared to land returning aircraft. At 9:20 on that 4th of June morning, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 toward the Japanese fleet, flying low over rolling Pacific swells with grim determination etched across his weathered face. Waldron, part Oglala Sioux, had argued vehemently with his strike group commander about the proper search vector. His instincts told him the Japanese fleet lay to the southwest, not where doctrine suggested. He broke formation, taking his squadron on an independent course that would write his name in history and condemn his men to fire and death. The TBD Devastator represented obsolete technology even in 1942. Slow, underarmed, and carrying torpedoes that functioned unreliably, the aircraft required long, straight attack runs at wave-top altitude to drop their weapons effectively. This approach transformed the Devastators into flying targets, vulnerable to both anti-aircraft fire and the lightning-fast Zeros that protected the Japanese carriers. Every pilot understood they flew a mission with minimal survival probability, yet they flew anyway. According to A Dawn Like Thunder by Robert Mrazek, Waldron had told his squadron before launching, "If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit." The pilots understood their commander's unspoken message. They were expendable pieces in a larger game, their lives' currency purchased for damage inflicted. Waldron's navigation proved impeccable. At 9:25, the Japanese carrier formation materialized through haze and scattered clouds, 4 flat tops arranged in a box formation, surrounded by protective screen of cruisers and destroyers, their wakes carving white scars across blue water. The carriers had just completed recovering Tominaga's Midway strike force, their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the anticipated strike against American carriers. "Attack immediately," Waldron transmitted, then led his squadron into a shallow dive toward the nearest carrier. Within seconds, Japanese lookouts spotted the approaching Americans. Zeros from the Combat Air Patrol, circling high above the fleet, rolled into diving attacks. Anti-aircraft guns on every ship began firing, creating a steel curtain through which the Devastators must fly. The first Devastator exploded into an orange fireball, struck by Zero cannon fire. Then another, and another. Zeros swarmed the formation like angry hornets, their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns shredding the slow-moving torpedo bombers. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron mates disintegrate around him, aircraft cartwheeling into the ocean trailing fire, others simply breaking apart mid-air as cannon shells found fuel tanks or bomb loads. Waldron's aircraft took hits almost immediately. Flames erupted from the engine cowling, smoke filling the cockpit. The Devastator staggered, losing altitude, but Waldron held course toward the carriers for several more agonizing seconds before the aircraft plunged into the Pacific. Neither Waldron nor his crew survived. One by one, Torpedo Squadron 8 died. Ensign Gay, his aircraft crippled and burning, managed to drop his torpedo before crashing into the ocean. He alone survived, clinging to a floating seat cushion, watching the battle unfold from water level as Japanese destroyers steamed past, close enough that he could see sailors on their decks. Of 15 aircraft and 30 men, 29 died that morning. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese ship. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They found the same deadly reception, Zeros tearing through formation, anti-aircraft fire creating a deadly lattice. Lindsay's aircraft fell flaming into the sea. Of 14 Devastators launched, 10 died without scoring hits. Then Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, adding their aircraft to the slaughter. 12 more Devastators attacked, 10 never returned. In less than 30 minutes, American Torpedo Squadron suffered catastrophic losses. 41 aircraft destroyed, over 80 aircrewmen killed or captured, and 0 hits on Japanese ships. The attack appeared to be a complete, devastating failure, the kind of tactical disaster that breaks fleets and loses battles. Japanese officers aboard the carriers watched the Americans perish with something approaching pity mixed with professional respect for their courage. Yet the torpedo bomber sacrifice accomplished what their weapons could not. The Japanese combat air patrol, drawn down to sea level chasing torpedo planes, left the high-altitude approaches undefended. The constant evasive maneuvering by Japanese carriers disrupted their preparations for launching their own strike. Flight deck crews paused their work to watch the attacks, then scrambled to resume rearming and refueling operations. Most critically, the torpedo attacks drew Japanese attention downward at precisely the moment American dive bombers approached from above. According to the account documented in Miracle at Midway by Gordon Prange, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons created a brief window of vulnerability, perhaps 5 minutes, where Japanese carriers sat fully exposed with armed and fueled aircraft crowding their flight decks, their defensive fighters at wave-top altitude unable to intercept high-altitude threats. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled 30 miles north of where the Japanese fleet should have been, his fuel gauge dropping toward critical levels as he searched empty ocean through the cockpit canopy of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. As commander of Enterprise's dive bomber group, McCluskey led 33 Dauntless aircraft, Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6, searching desperately for targets that seemed to have vanished like ghosts. The original navigation calculations had failed. The Japanese carriers were not where predicted. At 10 o'clock that morning, McCluskey faced the commander's nightmare. Continue searching and risk running out of fuel before reaching Enterprise, or abandon the search and return empty-handed, leaving the Japanese fleet unmolested to strike American carriers. His pilots waited for orders, their own fuel dwindling minute by minute. According to Barrett Tillman's Clash of the Carriers, McCluskey later admitted, this represented his loneliest moment, bearing responsibility for dozens of lives and potentially the battle's outcome. He decided to search southwest, trusting intuition over calculation. 5 minutes later, at 10:05, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer steaming northeast at maximum speed, trailing a distinctive white wake, the Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after conducting an anti-submarine sweep. McCluskey gambled everything on following that wake. 10 minutes later, the ocean revealed its terrible secret. Through scattered clouds, McCluskey spotted the entire Japanese carrier formation, all 4 flat tops arranged in their protective box, their decks crowded with aircraft. At that precise moment, 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3 to the same location, arriving by independent navigation. Through coincidence or fate, 2 American dive bomber formations converged simultaneously on the Japanese fleet from different directions. The Japanese carriers presented targets almost too vulnerable to believe, their flight decks jammed with aircraft being armed and fueled for the strike against American carriers. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the decks. Ordnance handlers moved bombs and torpedoes into position. The earlier rearming operations, ship-killing weapons swapped for land attack bombs, then partially reversed when American ships appeared, had left ammunition stacked haphazardly wherever space existed. The carriers were floating bombs awaiting detonation. Japanese lookouts spotted the American dive bombers at 10:24, screaming warnings across voice tubes and telephones. Admiral Nagumo's staff officers looked skyward with dawning horror. The combat air patrol, dozens of Zeros, remained at sea level after massacring torpedo squadrons. They could not climb to intercept altitude fast enough. Anti-aircraft gunners swung their weapons skyward and opened fire, but the approaching Americans came too fast, too many, from too many directions simultaneously. McCluskey selected Kaga, the nearest carrier, and rolled into his dive at 10:25. The Dauntless, designed specifically for this mission, dove nearly vertically, wind screaming past the cockpit, airspeed building toward terminal velocity. McCluskey centered the carrier in his telescopic sight, compensating for wind, speed, and the target's frantic evasive maneuvers. At 2,000 feet altitude, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of the dive, G-forces crushing him into his seat. The bomb struck Kaga near her island superstructure. A single hit, devastating but not necessarily fatal. Then more bombs arrived. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6's 2nd Division, selected Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, and dove through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black bursts. His bomb struck Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck near the elevators. A third bomb, possibly from Lieutenant Frederick Weber's aircraft, hit seconds later. The bombs punched through wooden flight decks into hangar spaces packed with armed, fueled aircraft and stacked munitions. The resulting explosions triggered secondary blasts of apocalyptic magnitude. Aviation fuel ignited, washing through hangar bays like liquid fire. Bombs cooked off in the heat, their detonations shredding internal bulkheads. Torpedoes armed for the strike against American carriers exploded with ship-killing force against their own carriers' structures. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Leslie's squadron attacked Soryu. Multiple hits struck within seconds, and the carrier immediately erupted into flames. Within minutes, Soryu transformed from lethal weapon to floating inferno. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, took fatal damage within 5 minutes, between 10:25 and 10:30, on the morning of June 4, 1942. The strike cost the Americans only 3 dive bombers. That 5-minute span represented perhaps the most decisive moment in the entire Pacific War. According to Craig Simons in The Battle of Midway, this brief engagement fundamentally shifted the war's strategic balance, transforming Japan from aggressor to defender in a single morning. Aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood on his bridge watching flames consume his flagship. Firefighting parties fought desperately to control blazes, but internal explosions repeatedly thwarted their efforts. The carrier's steering gear jammed, leaving the ship circling uselessly. The Hiryu, northernmost carrier in the Japanese formation, escaped the 10:30 dive bomber attack through fortunate positioning and immediate evasive action. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu's bridge, watched his sister ships writhe in flames with fury and heartbreak warring in his chest. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the Imperial Japanese Navy's elite striking force, transformed into floating pyres within minutes. Yet Hiryu remained operational, her flight deck undamaged, her air groups intact. Yamaguchi, recognized throughout the fleet as one of Japan's most aggressive and capable commanders, immediately ordered preparations for a counterstrike. According to Japanese sources compiled in Shattered Sword, Yamaguchi understood that Hiryu represented Japan's last chance to salvage something from catastrophe. If his aircraft could locate and destroy American carriers, the battle might yet turn. The Americans possessed numerical superiority now, but if he struck quickly while confusion reigned, perhaps he could even the odds. At 10:54, 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from Hiryu's deck. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike north-northeast, guided by scout plane reports indicating American carrier positions. The Japanese pilots, survivors of Pearl Harbor and countless other battles, flew with vengeance burning in their hearts. They had watched friends die in the morning's apocalyptic explosions. Now they would make the Americans pay. Meanwhile, aboard Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's staff evaluated damage reports from the morning strike. They had bloodied the enemy catastrophically, but the battle was far from finished. Radar operators watched their scopes vigilantly. Combat Air Patrol Wildcats circled overhead. Damage control parties stood ready. At noon, radar detected incoming aircraft 46 miles southwest. The Japanese counterstrike was coming. Yorktown's fighter director vectored Wildcats toward the threat while the carrier increased speed to maximum and turned into the wind. Gun crews manned their stations, training their weapons on the southwestern sky. The combat air patrol intercepted Kobayashi's formation 30 miles from the fleet, triggering a savage aerial melee. Wildcats and Zeros tangled in violent close-quarters combat, while the Japanese dive bombers pressed toward their target. American fighters shot down several attackers, but the formation's discipline held. At 12:10, surviving Japanese dive bombers rolled into their attacks despite heavy anti-aircraft fire from Yorktown and her screening vessels. Yorktown twisted desperately, her helmsman throwing the carrier into radical turns. Most Japanese bombs missed, raising towering waterspouts, but 3 struck home. The first penetrated deep into the carrier's interior before exploding, snuffing out boiler fires and killing engineering personnel. The second and third hits caused additional damage and started fires. Yorktown shuddered to a halt, dead in the water, thick black smoke pouring from her wounds. Yet the American carrier, though grievously wounded, survived. Damage control parties attacked the fires with practiced efficiency. Engineers worked frantically to restore power. Within an hour, through heroic effort chronicled in The Wounded Titan by Murray Williamson, Yorktown's crew restored partial power and had her making headway at 17 knots, slow, battered, but operational. The temporary reprieve proved brief. At 2:30 that afternoon, radar detected another incoming strike, 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros from Hiryu's second attack wave. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, wounded during the morning Midway strike, but refusing medical attention, personally led this attack despite his aircraft's damaged fuel tank. His determination exemplified the Japanese warrior code: duty unto death. Yorktown's combat air patrol intercepted the attackers, and anti-aircraft guns created a steel curtain, but the Japanese pilots pressed home their assault with unflinching courage. 5 torpedo bombers died in flames before reaching attack position. The survivors split into coordinated groups, attacking from multiple bearings simultaneously, precisely the tactic American torpedo squadrons had failed to execute that morning. Yorktown, slow and partially crippled from earlier damage, could not evade. 2 torpedoes struck her port side within seconds. The massive underwater explosions ruptured hull plates, flooded engineering spaces, and knocked out all power. The carrier listed dangerously to port, her flight deck tilting at alarming angles. At 3 o'clock, with the list increasing past 20 degrees, and fearing the ship might capsize, Yorktown's commanding officer ordered abandon ship. Tominaga's aircraft, crippled and leaking fuel, dove into the ocean rather than attempting return to Hiryu. The lieutenant commander died as he had lived, in service to his emperor and country, his sacrifice earning eternal veneration in Japanese naval tradition, but altering nothing strategically. Hiryu's 2 strikes had achieved what no other Japanese force managed that day, hitting American carriers. Yet the cost proved enormous, 28 aircraft and their crews lost, and the damage inflicted insufficient to change the battle's trajectory. Aboard Enterprise at 3:30 that afternoon of June 4th, dive bomber crews received urgent orders: locate and destroy Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier. Intelligence officers pieced together her position from radio intercepts and scout plane reports. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, now commanding Enterprise's dive bombers after McCluskey suffered wounds during the morning strike, led 24 Dauntless aircraft into the sky, their engines roaring as they climbed toward attack altitude. Lieutenant Samuel Adams from Yorktown's bombers, his carrier now listing helplessly, brought 10 additional Dauntless aircraft to join the strike. The orphaned Yorktown pilots flew with particular fury. Their home burned and might sink. Hiryu would pay for that injury. According to Richard Frank's detailed account in Tower of Skulls, this strike represented American naval aviation operating at peak effectiveness, coordinating assets from multiple carriers against a single target with lethal precision. At 5 o'clock, the American formation spotted Hiryu steaming northwest, protected by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and numerous destroyers. The Japanese combat air patrol had been reinforced, Zeros circling protectively above their last precious carrier. Hiryu's deck crews worked frantically preparing a 3rd strike wave. If they could launch before American attack, perhaps Hiryu might yet deliver decisive blows. Gallagher assessed the tactical situation quickly. Japanese fighters held altitude advantage, Anti-aircraft fire would be murderous, but surprise was impossible. The Japanese had spotted the approaching Americans and prepared reception. This would be a deliberate, methodical assault against an alert defended target. Gallagher ordered his formation into attack configuration. The dive bombers split into groups, approaching from multiple vectors to divide defensive fire. At 5-3, Gallagher rolled into his dive, committing to the attack irreversibly. Anti-aircraft shells burst around his aircraft, shrapnel pinging against aluminum skin. He ignored the fire, focused entirely on the gyrating carrier centered in his bomb site. The first bomb struck Hiryu's forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. The explosion triggered a chain reaction similar to what had destroyed her sister ships that morning. Aviation fuel ignited. Ammunition cooked off. Within minutes, Hiryu's interior became an inferno. More bombs struck in rapid succession. Lieutenant Adams' Yorktown refugees pressed their attacks with savage satisfaction, their bombs smashing into Hiryu's flight deck, island superstructure, and hangar spaces. The carrier staggered under the hammer blows, her hull shuddering with internal detonations as fire spread through her compartments. The entire attack lasted perhaps 10 minutes. When the American dive bombers turned eastward toward their carriers, Hiryu blazed from stem to stern. Firefighting efforts proved futile. The flames, fed by aviation fuel and munitions, raged beyond control. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on his bridge watching his command die, understanding that with Hiryu's destruction went Japan's last hope for victory at Midway. By 6 o'clock, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the vessels that had struck Pearl Harbor, devastated the Indian Ocean, and dominated the Western Pacific for 6 months, lay dead or dying. Japan's carrier striking power, carefully built over decades, ceased to exist in a single day. The strategic implications were staggering and immediately apparent to every senior officer in both fleets. Admiral Yamamoto, still aboard his battleship 300 miles northwest, received damage reports with stoic disbelief. His elegant plan had shattered completely. The diversionary Aleutian operation succeeded tactlessly. Japanese forces occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska, but this meaningless territorial gain paled against the carrier disaster. Without carriers, Yamamoto's battleships and cruisers were obsolete relics, powerful but irrelevant in a war dominated by naval aviation. At 7:15 that evening, Yamamoto transmitted orders canceling the Midway invasion. Japanese forces would withdraw. The admission of defeat tasted bitter as poison, but reality allowed no alternative. Without carrier air cover, his surface forces could not approach Midway without facing annihilation from American land-based aircraft. The Japanese withdrawal, however, proceeded chaotically. Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, attempting to coordinate scattered forces. Destroyers approached the dying carriers to rescue survivors. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, all burning uncontrollably, would require scuttling to prevent capture. At dawn on June 5th, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into Kaga, sending the carrier to the bottom. Akagi followed shortly after. Hiryu, her fires somewhat controlled, drifted helplessly through the night. Admiral Yamaguchi refused rescue, choosing to remain aboard his dying command. At 9 o'clock on the morning of June 5th, Hiryu capsized and sank, taking Yamaguchi and the carrier's captain to their graves, an act of ritual sacrifice that Japanese culture honored, but which altered nothing militarily. Soryu had already slipped beneath the waves during the night of June 4th, her hull gutted by fire and explosions. The morning of June 5th arrived with American forces pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet westward, seeking to inflict additional damage on a beaten enemy. Admiral Spruance, commanding American carriers after Fletcher transferred to a cruiser when Yorktown was abandoned, proceeded cautiously. His carriers had dominated the previous day's action, but he understood that Yamamoto's battleship force remained intact and dangerous. Overconfidence now might transform victory into disaster. The abandoned Yorktown drifted alone on the ocean's surface, listing heavily to port, but stubbornly refusing to sink. Her crew had evacuated the previous afternoon, picked up by screening destroyers. At first light, salvage officers examined the possibility of taking the carrier under tow. Despite catastrophic damage, fires, flooding, no power, a severe list, Yorktown's hull remained intact. Perhaps they could save her. The destroyer Hamann came alongside at dawn, putting damage control parties aboard the stricken carrier. Throughout June 5th, sailors fought to stabilize Yorktown's list and prepare her for towing. Pumps worked to remove water from flooded compartments. Welders attempted to shore up weakened bulkheads. The carrier showed signs of responding to treatment. Her list decreased slightly, giving hope that she might survive. Unknown to the Americans, Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Tanabe Yahachi, had been stalking the area. Tanabe spotted the stopped carrier and her destroyer escorts on the afternoon of June 6th. According to accounts in Silent Victory by Clay Blair Jr., Tanabe maneuvered carefully into attack position, understanding he had found a target of immense value. At 1:36 that afternoon, I-168 fired a spread of 4 Type 95 torpedoes at close range. 3 struck Yorktown on her starboard side, the opposite side from previous torpedo damage, negating the salvage crew's efforts to correct her list. The 4th torpedo struck Hamann, moored alongside. The destroyer's depth charges detonated when her keel broke, the underwater explosions killing many sailors in the water and inflicting additional damage on Yorktown. Hamann sank within 4 minutes, taking 80 men to their deaths. Yorktown absorbed the fresh torpedo damage with the resignation of a mortally wounded animal. Her list increased dramatically. Salvage parties evacuated again, acknowledging defeat. Throughout the night of June 6th, the carrier slowly rolled further to port, her death agonizingly prolonged. At dawn on June 7th, Yorktown finally surrendered to the ocean. The carrier that had fought at Coral Sea survived repairs in 72 hours and launched the strike that helped destroy 3 Japanese carriers, rolled completely over, and sank in 3,000 fathoms of water. She took 2,500 men's personal effects to the bottom: photographs, letters, mementos of lives disrupted by war, but relatively few of her crew, most having survived the abandonment and rescue operations. The American pursuit of Japanese forces continued through June 6th and 7th, but Spruance wisely declined to chase Yamamoto's battleships westward into range of Japanese land-based aircraft. Small-scale skirmishes occurred. American dive bombers attacked and damaged the cruiser Makuma, eventually sinking her, but no further major engagements developed. By June 7th, the Battle of Midway effectively concluded. The Butcher's Bill revealed victory's cost. American losses: carrier Yorktown, destroyer Hamann, 147 aircraft, and 307 personnel killed. The material losses hurt, but America's industrial capacity could replace ships and planes within months. The trained personnel represented irreplaceable assets. Each dead pilot or crew member embodied years of training and experience. But American training programs would generate replacements, even if less experienced ones. Japanese losses staggered by comparison: 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, heavy cruiser Makuma, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 personnel killed. The material losses approached catastrophic. Japan's industrial capacity could not replace 4 fleet carriers quickly, if at all. More devastating still, Japan lost the core of her trained carrier aviators, mechanics, and support personnel. These men represented a decade of training and combat experience, accumulated through China campaigns and 6 months of Pacific dominance. Their deaths created a gap Japan never filled. Cultural factors amplified Japanese personnel losses. American pilots who ditched near-friendly forces could be rescued and returned to duty. Japanese doctrine emphasized death over capture, leading many aviators to perish unnecessarily. American damage control doctrine emphasized saving ships. Japanese doctrine prioritized offensive action, leaving damage control as an afterthought. These cultural differences, seemingly minor, accumulated into strategic advantage for America. Military historians analyzing the battle identified multiple factors contributing to Japanese defeat. American code-breaking provided strategic advantage, placing Spruance and Fletcher in position to ambush Nagumo. The late-launching Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone delayed Japanese awareness of American carriers by crucial minutes. Nagumo's decision to rearm his reserve strike force for a second Midway attack left his carriers vulnerable at precisely the wrong moment. The sacrifice of American torpedo squadrons drew Japanese combat air patrols to sea level, clearing the way for dive bombers. Yet beneath these tactical factors lay a deeper strategic reality. Japan had launched a war she could not win through attrition. Admiral Yamamoto himself understood this truth. His Pearl Harbor attack aimed to force negotiated settlement before American industrial might could mobilize. Midway represented his attempt to repeat that decisive blow, crippling American naval power beyond recovery, and compelling Washington to accept Japan's Pacific conquests. The plan failed catastrophically. Instead of destroying American carriers and securing Japanese dominance, Midway eliminated Japan's own carrier striking force and handed strategic initiative permanently to the United States. From June 7, 1942 onward, Japan fought a defensive war of attrition against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The outcome became mathematically inevitable, though thousands would die before mathematics transformed into surrender. Admiral Nimitz, characteristically understated in his assessment, remarked that Midway would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. His prediction proved accurate. Before Midway, Japan advanced seemingly unstoppably across the Pacific and Asia. After Midway, Japan retreated slowly but inexorably toward her home islands, trading blood and treasure for time that ultimately bought nothing except delayed defeat. The battle also validated naval aviation's dominance over traditional surface warfare. Yamamoto's battleships, including the mighty Yamato, largest battleship ever constructed, never fired their main guns at American ships during Midway. Carriers proved decisive, battleships proved irrelevant. This lesson, written in flame and blood across Pacific waters, fundamentally reshaped naval doctrine for all nations. On June 13th, Admiral Nimitz toured Midway Atoll, walking among the coral runways pocked with bomb craters, examining damaged buildings and destroyed equipment. Marine defenders, grimy with soot and exhaustion, saluted their commander. Nimitz thanked them personally, understanding that Midway's defenders had bought time for his carriers to strike. Their courage under Japanese bombardment, though it resulted in heavy casualties and property damage, had disrupted Nagumo's timetable just enough to matter. News of Midway's outcome reached Tokyo on June 7th with devastating impact. The Imperial Japanese Navy initially attempted to conceal the disaster's magnitude, reporting only minor losses while claiming to have sunk 2 American carriers. This deception extended even to junior officers and enlisted personnel returning from the battle. Survivors received orders never to discuss the defeat and were quickly reassigned to prevent information leakage. According to Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya's account in Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, this institutional dishonesty prevented Japanese military leadership from honestly assessing their strategic position. Emperor Hirohito eventually learned the truth, though sanitized reports minimized the catastrophe's implications. The Imperial General Headquarters struggled to comprehend how dominance could transform so completely into defeat within hours. Some staff officers blamed Nagumo's indecisiveness. Others cited bad luck with scout plane launches. A few privately acknowledged that American code breaking had compromised operational security. None publicly admitted the fundamental miscalculation, underestimating American determination and capability to fight back devastatingly despite Pearl Harbor's losses. Japan's carrier construction program, already strained by resource limitations and competing military priorities, could not quickly replace the Midway losses. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku remained operational, supplemented by smaller carriers, but Japan never again fielded the concentrated striking power that had terrorized the Pacific from December 1941 through May 1942. Japanese shipyards laid keels for new carriers, Taiho, Shinano, and others, but these vessels would not join the fleet for many months, and by then American shipyards would be producing carriers at rates Japan could not match. More critically, Japan could not replace lost pilots and aircrew. Training programs expanded frantically, but time constraints forced reduced training standards. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with fewer flight hours and less thorough preparation than the veterans who died at Midway. This qualitative decline compounded quantitative disadvantages, creating a death spiral. Inexperienced pilots died more frequently, requiring even more rapid replacement with even less trained aviators. Meanwhile, American industrial mobilization accelerated dramatically. President Franklin Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy transformed theoretical productive capacity into concrete military hardware. Shipyards launched escort carriers in weeks, fleet carriers in months. Aircraft production exceeded projections. Pilot training programs, expanded after Pearl Harbor, generated thousands of aviators monthly. The quantitative advantage America possessed potentially in December 1941 became manifest reality by late 1942. Admiral Yamamoto, his strategic vision shattered at Midway, turned his attention toward the Solomon Islands campaign. Japanese forces had occupied these islands to threaten Australia and secure the southern Pacific perimeter. American leadership, recognizing opportunity, planned to seize Guadalcanal and its partially completed airfield. This decision initiated a brutal 6-month campaign of attrition that would further deplete Japan's carrier aviation strength. The Guadalcanal campaign began in August 1942 when United States Marines stormed ashore, capturing the airfield, soon renamed Henderson Field, and triggering ferocious Japanese response. Naval battles erupted repeatedly in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal, Savo Island, Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, Guadalcanal Naval Battle. These engagements consumed Japanese carrier aircraft and pilots at unsustainable rates while American losses, though severe, could be replaced. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft severely damaged the carrier Hornet, veteran of the Doolittle raid in Midway, eventually sinking her. Japan claimed victory, but the battle's true victor became apparent when examining loss ratios. America lost 1 carrier but could build replacements. Japan lost dozens of irreplaceable veteran aircrew and could not. Historians analyzing the Pacific War's turning points consistently identify Midway as the decisive strategic shift. The battle did not immediately doom Japan. The war continued for 3 more bloody years, but Midway established the trajectory. Japan's offensive capability peaked on June 3, 1942. From June 7 onward, Japan fought delaying actions, trading space for time, hoping America might weary of the war's cost and negotiate settlement. This hope proved as illusory as the belief that Pearl Harbor would break American will. American intelligence, having proven decisive at Midway through code-breaking, continued providing strategic advantage throughout the war. Commander Rochefort and his station hypo-cryptanalysts received recognition, though Rochefort himself faced bureaucratic politics that delayed his appropriate honors until decades later. The intelligence organization built during desperate early war months matured into sophisticated operations that consistently gave American commanders awareness of Japanese intentions. The Battle of Midway also validated aggressive damage control procedures that saved American ships repeatedly. Yorktown's survival after Coral Sea, her rapid repairs in Pearl Harbor, and her continued operation despite catastrophic damage at Midway demonstrated American naval engineering expertise. Japanese carriers, designed for offensive striking power with minimal armored protection and inadequate damage control facilities, proved fragile when struck. This design philosophy reflected pre-war assumptions that Japanese carriers would hit first and hardest. Midway revealed the fallacy of such assumptions. Admiral Yamamoto survived Midway by 11 months. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville Island and shot him down, killing Japan's most capable naval strategist. The attack succeeded because American intelligence had decoded Japanese communications detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour schedule. His death, like Midway itself, demonstrated that intelligence advantage translated directly into tactical and strategic superiority. The 4 Japanese carriers sunk at Midway remain on the ocean floor, their exact locations undiscovered until recent decades. Akagi was located in October 2019 by the research vessel Petrel. Kaga's wreck was found the same year, resting upright in over 17,000 feet of water. The carriers rest as underwater monuments to tactical decisions made in minutes that shaped years of warfare. Yorktown's wreck was discovered in May 1998 by oceanographer Robert Ballard, the same man who located Titanic. The carrier sits upright on the ocean floor, her hull remarkably intact despite catastrophic damage, a testament to American shipbuilding quality. The discovery provided closure for surviving crew members who attended memorial ceremonies honoring their lost shipmates. Veterans of Midway, American and Japanese survivors alike, carried the battle's memories throughout their lives. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent decades honoring his fallen squadron mates through lectures and writings. Japanese survivors, constrained by cultural shame associated with defeat, spoke less publicly but remembered equally vividly. Annual reunions brought former enemies together in reconciliation, transforming wartime hatred into mutual respect between warriors who had faced death together, albeit from opposite sides. The strategic lessons of Midway extended far beyond the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated that technological advantage could be negated by superior intelligence, better training, and tactical flexibility. It proved that courage without proper support meant noble sacrifice but not victory. American torpedo bomber crews displayed extraordinary valor, but achieved nothing without dive bombers arriving at the critical moment. It showed that complex plans requiring precise timing and coordination often fail when confronted by enemy action and the fog of war. Military academies worldwide study Midway as a case study in decisive battle, analyzing decisions made under pressure with incomplete information. Admiral Nagumo's dilemma, caught between rearming for different target types while under air attack, illustrates the friction inherent in military operations. His choices, criticized by historians with hindsight's clarity, reflect the impossible situation created by American code-breaking, tactical surprise, and the sacrifice of torpedo squadrons that fixed his attention at sea level while dive bombers approached from above. The battle also highlighted industrial capacity's role in modern warfare. Japan won tactical victories throughout 1942 and 1943, yet each victory depleted irreplaceable resources, while America's losses, though painful, represented temporary setbacks. By 1944, American carrier task forces operated with impunity across the Pacific, their numerical superiority and pilot quality overwhelming remaining Japanese resistance. The pathway from Midway's balance to later dominance ran directly through American factories producing ships and aircraft faster than Japan could sink them. For the United States, Midway provided psychological vindication after Pearl Harbor's humiliation. Americans needed proof their military could defeat Japan decisively. Midway delivered that proof, transforming national mood from defensive anxiety to confident offense. War bond sales increased. Industrial worker productivity rose. Military recruiting surged. The battle's moral impact exceeded its material significance, though the material significance proved enormous. For Japan, Midway represented the beginning of the end, though few recognized it immediately. The Imperial Japanese Navy, blooded but unbowed, continued fighting with fanatical determination for 3 more years. But the strategic initiative shifted permanently to America at Midway, never to return. Every subsequent Japanese operation, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, represented reactive defense rather than offensive conquest. 79 years have passed since that June morning when dive bombers screamed down through scattered clouds to strike Japanese carriers in their most vulnerable moment. The men who fought there, American and Japanese alike, are mostly gone now, claimed by age as warfare claimed their youth. Their story endures, however, taught to each new generation of naval officers as the exemplar of how battles can turn on moments, how courage intersects with luck, and how wars are won not by single engagements but by the industrial, intellectual, and moral resources nations bring to sustained conflict. The Pacific Ocean keeps its secrets well, holding in its depths the shattered remains of carriers, aircraft, and men who fought for their nations with everything they possessed. 3 miles down in eternal darkness rest Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and Yorktown, monuments not to victory or defeat but to the terrible price warfare demands and the courage with which ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances. Midway's legacy extends beyond military history into the realm of national mythology. For Americans, the battle represents underdog triumph, careful preparation, defeating overconfidence, intelligence, and courage, combining to overcome material disadvantage, in the war's early months. For Japanese, Midway represents tragedy, the moment when victory's certainty transformed into defeat's inevitability, when the Pacific ceased being Japan's ocean and became contested space where American power would eventually prove overwhelming. The battle's outcome vindicated Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war pessimism about fighting America. He had warned Japanese leadership that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but could not guarantee victory in extended conflict. Midway occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's prediction proved tragically accurate for Japan. In the final analysis, the Battle of Midway demonstrates warfare's essential nature. Violence in service of political objectives, where success depends not merely on tactical excellence, but on intelligence, logistics, industrial capacity, training quality, and the intangible factors of determination and adaptability. Japan's fleet relied on timing, but Midway struck before they were ready. That simple truth, written across 4 days of combat in June 1942, changed history's course and determined the Pacific War's outcome as surely as if the fighting had ended that week, rather than continuing for 3 more bloody years. The lesson remains relevant. In warfare, as in life, timing matters. Being unprepared when the critical moment arrives means defeat regardless of theoretical strength, careful planning, or past victories. Midway's carriers burned because they were caught at precisely the wrong moment, with armed and fueled aircraft crowding their decks. That vulnerability, measured in minutes, cost Japan the war.